Okay, so before I begin, I do have a script as usual. I'm not going to go into the whole spiel. I'll put that in the description. But I do want to say I am absolutely interested in doing these in more detail, but with how much time, energy, and focus it takes to do like all these individually, I won't do it unless it's like wanted enough. I will also try skipping the summaries to see if it is generally more preferable to the viewer. It's my second least favorite part of doing these videos. The first is editing, of course. But if it's that uninteresting for me, I probably won't make you interested in it. And overall, I generally would prefer it if the reader did, or if the viewer did read it, if they really wanted those intricacies. Otherwise, all this is getting the viewer to apply this kind of stuff to their own stories or to practice it on other stories. So I think it's just a waste of time. But if it's not, I will maybe like do like a transcript for it, because it is nice to like get the details and like reminders and stuff down. But overall, I don't think it will be. And then with that said, I also won't be doing as big of a deep dive into the stories, at least for this video. I kind of want to see if it's better to do it this way, because again, the big part is getting you to apply this stuff into your own stories and to use it yourself. And I do feel that giving my solution to everything kind of makes it less likely for a person to do that, because I already have like a very interesting way. Now I already did it a way they would have done it if they had the time to do it themselves. So I'll give a general basis of like thoughts I was having when I was getting ready to make these videos and stuff, but I will not be going into detail and stuff like that, because I do want to leave room for other people to do this themselves. Okay, I will be starting with the Song of the Lioness series. I am mostly going to be focusing on that first book, and then give a brief insight into the other ideas I had for further on. So with Song of the Lioness, we have 4 books that nowadays could be bigger and may need to be altered to fit current values, but not too much that it loses its original identity. The first 3 books are less than 300 pages, and the fourth is less than 400 pages. I think it is safe to say that we can add about 100 to 200 pages worth of content to each of these books. At the most, we could double the page count, but only if some of the ideas I pose are able to be developed further and, fill the story, instead of making it just seem like filler content, essentially. Like, we have to make it essential to the plot. If we did this max number, so if we're doubling it, book 1 would only have 584 pages. So I do think that's doable. A lot of the YA fantasy books are that long anyway. And one thing I want to talk about before continuing on is why it's so often seen that the books in a series increase in word counts, and why many beginner authors start with lesser word count books before starting to have books with longer word counts published. And this is more with the traditional publishing, because indie authors can do whatever they want. So a lot of readers are intimidated by bigger books. So starting out a series with a smaller book at the beginning, or maybe like a few books, will get them interested. So they get excited when they see a bigger book versus like dreading it because they want more content with these people. You probably don't need a whole lot of examples because you've noticed it yourself. Okay, so there's also this thing with trust. Would you rather pick up a large book by an untried author or one by one you know writes well? Could have wrote that better, but you probably get my gist. So publishers do have to think about this as well, which is why you should try to publish books that have lesser word counts with them and save the longer word counts for when they're confident in your ability to sell. So, because it's also like more expensive to like have to edit longer books, and it's more expensive to work on and all that stuff. Another reason for the increased page counts as a book or as a series goes on is also due to like the plot getting more complicated. And so like the beginning was just setting up for the more complicated plot, like more is happening. Stuff is simpler, and then you get it. We are also going to pretend that this series is going to be re-released. This will bring old and new fans alike to the series. So we'll have to stay true, but also add enough of a difference to make the reread worthwhile. And one thing a lot of people don't like to consider legit is fanfiction. What goes on in fanfiction is a good indicator of what fans of a specific series want more of. And most fanfictions like to explore different characters and relationships that weren't explored in the books. Sometimes there are like just complete whole fix-it fix as well, but fandoms like adding headcanons to characters to have more ways to relate to these characters or to make them feel more human. Or they will take this group of characters and put them in a completely different world and see kind of what would change if they did that, or if they altered certain things in the universe. Like, what if this one rule was different? What if these characters switched places? There's a lot of things, but a lot of it has to do with like character study and spending time with characters they enjoy more, and relationships they want to see explored. But there's also the unmentionables, but we're not worried about that right now. And this is not to say you need to do a lot of like fan service because that can ruin stories. But it is important to have an idea of how much your readers would prefer this thing over that thing. So like tragic ending versus everybody lives ending kind of thing. Readers can feel betrayed if they feel tricked into reading a story they wouldn't have wanted to otherwise, and that can lead them to not continuing to read your books. But that does not mean you can't add those kinds of twists. You would just need to know from the get-go what's going to happen and what hints or marketing tactics you would use to get your readers to understand the potential disappointments they could face if something in the story doesn't turn out as expected. So another thing to consider is why a series like Throne of Glass is so loved by many readers but hated by many more. It's because it caters to its specific fan base. Like, it knows what its fans want, but like, I feel like it's less of the author just ruining the story to cater to the fans versus it was always the kind of story she may have wanted to write and she just found the right group of people to read it and she's like holding on to that group of people. It also gives enough fulfillment for fanfiction-like content that even though it is very popular, it doesn't have as much fanfiction as one would think because, yeah, all the characters kind of get their due. There's also the fact that many authors and books that originate with fanfiction have the same kind of effect within its readers. There's Marissa Myers, Claudia Gray, Naomi Novik, Cassandra Clare, although there is controversy with Cassandra Clare. I don't know about the other authors, though. I just know that there's a lot of fanfiction writers, if not the story itself was originally a fanfiction, that happen to have the same effect within their books. And these are just the authors that fit within the genre that this series is in, like YA, female-led fantasy, you know. So this may seem like, oh, fanfiction is only for teens, but that is not true. And if you want proof that adults can enjoy it, I mean, I do read some fanfiction, but like, there's fanfiction for A Song of Ice and Fire, and that's like one of the most adult series out there. And conflict, like, there's so much like, I mean, I guess George R.R. Martin does say he's like a gardener, and there's so many things that we can like pick up and, you know, plant for ourselves for our own stuff. Like, there are so many things like that, and it does help that, you know, it's incomplete, so people want to finish it themselves. But essentially, even if you don't like any of these authors or any of these series I mentioned, you can't deny that they are successful and they are well loved. Okay, so watching the market to see how you should market yours isn't just looking at the present, but the past as well. And just because there's no market for what you want to put out, all you have to do is find a way to twist your strategy to make people interested in something going against the grain, something new. Because I get into this with this series, Song of the Lioness, of reading too much of the same thing and just getting tired of it. Like, that, it happens. That's why there's these like trends that happen, like with everything. I'm saying all of this because doing rewrites to republish a series like this is kind of a big no-no. And while this isn't like a real thing I'm doing, I'm imagining that we are going to be doing this. So this is stuff we have to think about. And like for indie authors especially, they don't have other people to think about this for them, so they got to do it themselves. And again, if you're a self-publisher, you have more flexibility to do things like this if you are careful with how you do it. Like, I know there is a popular YouTuber, Daniel Green, where he's doing that and he's like giving the funds of like the first book to charity. Of the new first book that he's rewriting. So like there is ways to do it. And especially if you have a very big like authorship type fan base, they kind of understand. And yeah, although there will be some people who will absolutely hate it. So one way I think it's a good idea for this particular series, and would be more than just appreciated, is because of how old the series is and how popular it still is, and how there is proof recently that nostalgia sells. Granted, there are some people who are mad with how nostalgia has been selling because the new stuff isn't doing justice to the old stuff, but that just proves that people want good nostalgia content. Even if it's done in a way that not everyone appreciates, as long as like, I don't want to say true fans, but like the right fans appreciate it. So like the core fans, but it's not like a gatekeeping kind of thing. But like, Game of Thrones is another good example, is where there's more fantasy in the book series, but they wanted to cater to non-fantasy based viewership. And so they cut out a lot of the fantasy stuff and they cut out a lot of stuff that other people would have wanted to see in the series. So yeah, I mean, it's still good, but they did cut a lot of that out. And these things I'll be brushing on doesn't necessarily have to be a book series, but it could be implemented into a TV series. So again, like if you want to try redoing it, maybe do it in a different medium. So how I go about this may be a bit chaotic, but I'm attempting to show the thought process involved rather than just the finished product. So one thing that is likely to happen is repetitiveness and jumping back and forth from one thing to the other, because while thinking of something, I'll think of something else. Like, it's all connecting as I'm going, essentially, is what's happening. And that's just how my brain works. How are we going to add more content to the series? We are going to include more point of views and change one person's storyline and add a subplot to make it fit. That way we get a variety of extra content while being able to keep some, if not most, of the original writing. There will be... probably not most. I mean, maybe. Doesn't matter. Okay. So despite mentioning the Throne of Glass series, I am actually going to be using other series as inspiration, though there will be some Throne of Glass flavoring thrown in. I do want some alternative type series in there as well, but it's hard for me to pin down where exactly the inspiration will be coming from. So I'm probably going to be influenced by a lot of different things, but these are just the ones that kept coming up in my mind as I was thinking of things I could relate this to. And so one of those is the Girl of Fire and Thorns series, where the lead isn't a typical heroine and her story isn't really told in the typical war way either. There is some things about it, but overall it's not. And one of the non-typical heroine thing is she is heavier weight. She is constantly put down and all this stuff. Stuff happens to her that isn't in the normal kind of YA stuff that I was reading back then. And it just really stuck with me, even if it's not the best series, because again, it's been so long since I've read this. Even if I go back and read it and realize it's not as good as I thought, the fact that it had these small differences really stuck with me and has made me keep it on my shelf for so long and want to keep it on my shelf for so long. I do remember reading a book called Defy that had a very similar concept as Song of the Lioness, with a girl pretending to be a boy in order to become a knight. There's a lot of those out there. A lot. I mean, Mulan is one. But another one I read with the same plot point started out as a Wattpad story, and it was called Paladin. Again, so Defy I hated. Paladin, again, is probably not well written at all, but it had enough uniqueness to it that it still had it's still up there for me. But if I reread it, I would probably cringe that I liked it. That's what happens when you are reading a lot of the same thing over and over and over again, is you get tired of seeing all that stuff and you appreciate the small thing. This happens when you're looking for fan fiction too. You start out with really high standards and then you start getting lower standards. But that's not to say that's exactly what this is. That's not to say that these books aren't as good as Song of the Lioness, because actually I feel some of them are better because Song of the Lioness has the problems of how old it is and what was kind of allowed then. Tamora Pierce wasn't allowed to do certain things, she had to cut stuff out. But it's similar enough. And the problem with Defy is it was the cliche, the most cliche thing, and all the characters felt like these cutouts and they weren't deep enough. It's actually also a very skinny book, yet somehow probably about the same size as the Alana books, but it might be nostalgia playing a factor, but Alana still wins by far. So just because I like those unique elements does not mean I'm going to copy them and paste them into my story. I am going to sit down, I am going to study them and how they all work together. So the system of how it works and what the author was likely thinking. I'm going to try to get into that mindset and how they thought this could apply to this, how maybe with the heavier set princess, how that will add complications to that. Just getting to that mindset of figuring out how to think of these things and how to implement it into this setting, into this plot, into this cast of characters. What are things those three things can bring into this story that I'll have to do a similar system with, is essentially what it is. I did not explain it well in my script and I was confusing myself, so I had to try this way. So hopefully that was good. Here are the main characters. I do a lot with my hands, I'm sorry. So here are the main characters I propose we will be using. Alana, obviously, her brother Tom, Jonathan, and George. There are a few more I wish I'd say we could add, like Raoul and another character. I feel like his name is Alex, but I don't know what happened to my copy. I was carrying it around a lot when I was originally going to do this, and I lost it. And this character turns against the other friends, and so having his POV might have been interesting. But it is possible that with these added characters of Raoul and Jonathan, that we'd get more of him anyway, so we don't necessarily need him as a point of view character. And it is possible that we could have one-off points of view of certain characters. It's already kind of does that. It does a bit of head jumping or scene jumping. It's what I'm talking about. Well, it's generally frowned upon to do that, but there are ways that I don't think it's a problem. It just kind of takes you out of the immersion. Since the series is about Alana, she'll have the most time. And then Tom will have the least time since he's away from the story. So Alana's story is about her journey into becoming the first female knight in a long time, and is also ends up becoming one of the best knights in the realm. Jonathan is the prince who will inherit the throne, and George is the king of thieves, and Tom is studying in this to become a sorcerer, but I also think it's a religious place. So Jonathan is a good friend of Alana's and goes through knight training alongside her and serves as a potential love interest. He's a little older because she can become his squire later, but they still have this, general friendship. Age gap isn't too big. But then there's George, who is an older friend, and at first he seems older than the author claims he is, but from Alana's point of view, that kind of might make sense. So George also acts as a provider to Alana since he's already at the top and wants to see Alana succeed. So there is that. It's not just the age difference of him being 17 or 18 and her being 12, 10 or 11 or 12 or 13, whatever it was. It's also the power dynamic difference of, he's already here and she's here, and there's a lot of room for grooming and stuff happening. So I will be altering that slightly. There's options to do it with the age gap, and then also options to do it with the power dynamics. We could do both, or we could do one or the other. Or if it's just a part of the story that the author would want to have more on, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Would like to have some kind of discussion on it in there, we could do that too. But I'm just cutting that last option out for this video. And then the altering of George and Alana's relationship isn't just because of the romance, but also because the subplot I'll be adding has more to do with George than the rest of them, and it affects Alana differently. Okay, so I'm going to make book 1 a book about beginnings. So rather than have George already at the top, I will have him working towards being at the top. So our 3 main characters are starting at different degrees of lowness, aka privilege and opportunities that they get. So there's Jonathan, who is the prince and heir to the kingdom. So he's up here. There is Alana, who is a noble, so below Jonathan, but is also female. And I think she's a lower noble too, but whatever. So she's down there. And then there's George. He becomes the king of thieves. So whereas, he probably started out with nothing, and he doesn't have opportunities. Everything he does, he does get, he has to do it himself. And so, but maybe he'll end up finding that he does have some opportunities and privileges that other people don't have. If there was another female who didn't happen to be a noble, there's a lot of discussion that could go on there. And this is the perfect series to have that in. If we were doing a rewrite on this series, otherwise we could just apply it to a different series altogether. Because I'm kind of regretting not doing a full list of outline or whatever of everything I would be doing with it. But so as for the age gap thing, Alana starts out as a child and George as a teenager. They are about 6 to 7 years apart, although it seems more, especially at first. While he doesn't act romantically towards her till she's older, the age difference with them meeting while she was a child, and how much power and influence he had compared to her, are red flags for many current readers. There's also the fact that many of Pierce's romance have age gaps, and there's one with an even more significant age gap later on in another series that she has. So what I'm going to do is lessen the age gap a little and make him struggle alongside her, and make it more obvious that he wasn't romantically inclined towards her at first. It gets a little iffy there because there's this fate thing going on where he's you're the one, but not romantically. He just knows that there's something there, and it might have to do with fate or whatever, but it's still, yeah, especially since he didn't know she was female at first. The readers do, and so they still kind of get that. Are they going to be trying to push this romance because of the kind of fated soulmate type thing that is a trope? If that's the word. For some reason, my brain is dying on all the words I'm trying to think of. Okay, so since Alana is a girl and a shorter one, I find it likely she is older than she looks. So while she looks like she could be a boy of 10 or 11, in reality she's 12 or 13. So that could, add a year within the age gap, shorten it by a year or 2. With George being at 17 at the start, it's somehow the King of Thieves, that shortens their age gap to 4 or 5 years. But let's say we shorten George by a year as well, because let's say the author might be important to the author that he reaches the King of Thieves thing at such a small age. at such like a lower age. What's the word? Oh, despite being so young. This is my life. If I'm not writing, this is how my brain works. One problem that we might have with this change is with Elena's age, she likely would have already had started her period, which is a thing that happens in the story, and she turns to George, Sasha's mother, for help since she can't turn to anyone else in the castle. And that's essentially when George learns she's a woman. So you can see kind of why that certain readers have a problem with that. It could still happen if necessary, because it's just, while the scene itself I don't think was necessarily like bad, like it didn't scream anything super like negative or whatever to me. Thinking of the connotations behind the scene and like how it relates to like real life stuff and perceptions and whatnot, I can see the problems with it. But again, it depends on how it's handled. I don't think it's an entirely necessary thing to have, but at the same time, I'm not going to fight to like get rid of it or anything, because my whole opinion on all this stuff is you can't have like same thing with like writing books. There's always going to be an exception to the rule. So even though, and just like people's relationships and lives are like so complicated, and themselves are so complicated, that it's hard to try and fit it into these ideals of it has to happen like this, it has to be this way. When for other people, maybe it is better to kind of not be in the box and like to do these kind of things that society deems they shouldn't. Because how often has society been wrong about stuff like that in the past too? So, and granted, this whole idea comes from past stuff, but again, it's just this whole discussion that I'm only bringing up because it is relevant to this book, and with the current climate right now, it is something you have to think about, and you have to be careful with whichever path you take. That like if you are gonna like, I don't want to say preaching, but if you are gonna include some of this stuff in your book, you have to make it so that like it's relevant to the story and it's not just an obvious like call out to political stuff, unless that the book is about calling out recent political stuff, because there are some books like that. But this is a fantasy from long ago, and so I'm not going to turn it into like a whole political kind of dilemma thing, or woke or unwoke or anti-woke. I'm not getting into that. Okay, so Elena's story will remain relatively the same, only changing to adapt to George's story and to the flaggy changes. And I only say flaggy because like it's only flag. It's not like, I'm not saying this is bad. It's just, it brings up flags that people are going to be extra like, I got to pay more attention to this, you know. So to the flaggy changes we'll be making regarding the relationship, which won't be much outside of the subplot changes. So we can keep the majority of it, but we will have this added subplot that'll alter some things. So mainly what will be happening in book 1, Elena is learning to accept there are different kinds of nobility and honor, and she can't fully apply her ideals to people who don't live in her class and have the same privileges, even though, you know, like she also thinks that she doesn't have any privileges. I guess this whole book is going to be like a privilege check for everybody, or this whole series, but it's not going to be, again, the social commentary on that. It's going to be like based on our world. It's still going to be based on this world. And yeah, I hope you understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying we turn this into like this whole political mess, and I don't even want to say conversation, because most of the time it's not a conversation. It's just pointing fingers of rage. But she also learns that there are similar problems and that people aren't different on either side of the line. She was kind of raised in like a little bit of seclusion because she was like a country noble, and so, you know, that might have to do with something like the difference between city and like lower life. If we were to want to add a little bit of like recent social commentary, again, not recommending it, we could do something about how smaller towns in the US and maybe other like whiter nations tend to be more white, but also like that's usually their home country, versus where cities tend to be more diverse. But it also just, it makes sense that it's that way. Like it makes sense. But again, this is already a theme of the book. So these are just other topics we can find ways to implement into the story if we really wanted to have this discussion. Because Tamora Pierce already is like, I've noticed, she defends her choices. She defends her decisions. Like she'll maybe like make some alterations or whatever, but like overall, she knows what she wants, and she wants this. And so she is going to have to find ways to defend certain situations and plot ideas and stuff without getting taken out of the story. It's a delicate balance. So there's good and bad people everywhere, and it's what you do. So, sorry, full 180. Going back to the script, there's good and bad people everywhere. It's what you do with what you've been given that matters. So it seems natural to me. That can also apply to her magic. I think I only bring it up mildly, but like her cheating with magic is something that this will also like be commenting on. I can't think of words. So it seems natural to me that their relationship, and by their I mean George and Alana's relationship, will start out a bit more rocky at the beginning. Since he doesn't have the means to help her as much as he did in the original, this seems natural, especially that he's going to probably use her because he needs that. So the way they would meet would likely be different as well. The go-to is him stealing from her or maybe Corm and having a chase scene. As much as I love that, I want to see different stuff every once in a while. So another thing is, again, going back on my thing that he would need to use her, maybe he's able to lure her and get her attention because he needs her for something. And maybe Coram like warns Alana about him, but she's like overconfident and does this thing. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I don't want it to be the typical he'll steal something and then urge her on. I mean, we could do that if we wanted to, but I would try to avoid that if I could. So also, he still thinks she's a boy at this point in time, and maybe an impressionable and easy to see. These words. So, and maybe an impressionable and easy to deceive one. And when he learns she's a girl, that could be a topic brought up and dealt with. Because again, that's what a lot of people fear in these kinds of relationships, is like these younger women being super impressionable. Without getting into details, this subplot would be taking down the current King of Thieves, who's going to be like rotten, like the worst King of Thieves ever. George would be teaming up with nobles, whatever their age, since Alana and Jonathan are on like the younger side. Him teaming up with nobles to do so would make sense alongside the original, where nobles and royalty still respect him and do not try to apprehend him, despite him being a known and infamous criminal. I know there are some stories that kind of get into like how that system works, but like this one, it just seems that it's mostly just Jonathan. But again, it would give more basis of that relationship. Okay, so it doesn't have to be exactly that. I do think it's the best choice. We'll get into that later. So it doesn't, but the end product is learning the world is more complicated than they realize, and their biases and misconceptions naturally lead to misunderstandings and have to do with the flaws of the societal system they live in. Alana, just saying that, like, my worries is if they do end up doing a rewrite for some reason, that they will get too much into it and the story will get lost in the process. But let's hope that doesn't happen. So, Alana and Jonathan will still go back to the city. Alana and Jonathan will still go to the Black City, that's what it's called, and we'd have to find a way for it to mirror George and Tom's stories. But again, Tom is lesser. I'll get into kind of ideas for that later. So ultimately, it's that last piece that would be a bit more difficult to reconcile with this change. Maybe George was struggling with similar confidence issues as like Alana was, and Jonathan might be having some, but again, I'll get into more details on him later. So, but for George, so that we don't have this complete repetition of like similar characters and experiences and situations, I'm thinking we make him overconfident in his abilities and he gets humbled. And he gets humbled by like almost being killed, or I do this later, letting the King of Thieves get away or something, or just losing flat out. And bonus points if it's something that Alana was worried about, since them being wrong and right about things can even out. It's not just Alana in the wrong. Usually it's kind of the underdog doing more of the preaching than, I don't want to say overdog, but you know, I don't want to say normal either. I say normal too a lot, and that's not. So Tom's story will come later. But what about Jonathan? Since he's with Alana, he could mirror her journey and gain his own confidence. Or maybe he isn't challenged, or maybe he's humbled in the Black City. But again, now that's matching George's thing. And we already have one person who learns to be more confident and another person who learns to be less confident. Those seem like the only two directions, but it's a false dichotomy. The other option is he isn't challenged or changed too much, since there are people like that. His biases and ideals are only getting reinforced. Because it was him that decided to go to the Black City anyway and do all this stuff. And there is like problems later that he gets into of like his character growth. And I just think it's natural to do that. And then you get, again, 3 different reactions to similar situations that are affected by like past privileges and stuff. So with back to the George and the King of Thieves plotline I was thinking about, that would happen alongside Elena going against a corrupted noble in book 2. So I think I settled on he doesn't defeat the King of Thieves. Or maybe he's not even planning on defeating the King of Thieves. Maybe it's like a smaller rebellion, but he's not full on taking on the King of Thieves yet. Because in book 2, Elena is going up against this corrupted noble who, in this rewrite, could be working alongside the King of Thieves. Or maybe is the King of Thieves. Or is controlling the current King of Thieves. Who knows? There's a lot of different things we can consider. So, now, back to Jonathan. Since later in the series, he still has an entitlement problem. I already said that. He grows away from Alana, and maybe it's because he goes through less growth as a person, while Alana has changed and grown a lot. He's not a terrible person or king, but there's still many flaws, and again, we get the 3 different stories. I'm going to say it differently because I do say it. I'm going to say it again because I do say it a little differently. So we'd get 3 different stories as to how people could react and choose to grow one way or not at all, and how they use what they have, which also has to do with Elena and her relationship with magic, and others' view on those who use magic to like cheat, even though it's like this, again, a whole other conversation one could be having of like the naturally gifted versus kind of, or like the extraordinary versus the ordinary. Like, why tear down the people who have these extra stuff to make them to your level when they could be using like this other stuff for like good? And I don't know. It's just, again, it's ripe with a lot of different possibilities of different conversations and things to navigate through. And it could be a very dangerous navigation, but if done right, it would be very good. So another problem I'd like to mention lies in book 3. Again, another really sensitive issue. And some people like would say, oh, I'm not going to read this author because they had this kind of stuff in the books. This series is old, and Tamora Pierce was like ahead of her time, but she's still affected by her time. And so, like in book 3, The Woman Who Rides Like a Man, the idea of a white savior amongst people of darker skin and more primitive ways, that happens. The only thing I will say to that is make it so, because again, I don't want to take away the author's vision on that. Like, I'm still going to try to leave it relatively the same, but we do have to consider the current climate. So before I get into it, I'll get into this. So the only thing I will say to the only thing I was planning on saying then to that is making it so Elena and maybe later Jonathan help them save themselves. And instead of becoming leaders of that tribe, they just become ambassadors of kind and are willing to lend support to them to help them improve their country or their whatever their way. Maybe this is another place where Elena can realize how different she and Jonathan are and how much she has grown and how much he hasn't, rather than the realization coming just in regards to their romance. Maybe he does come around at the end and that's his shining moment of growth. Or maybe it's just he doesn't do the bad thing. He just stays neutral. Or, there's a lot of different things you can do with that. And then book 4 is where ultimately Tom will get the growth. So there's Elena in book 1, George in book 2, Jonathan in book 3, Tom in book 4. And in my mind, Tom would start out with less content and slowly get more as his story kind of becomes more relevant to the story because he's a major part of why book 4 happens. And then there's Jonathan, who starts out with more and then slowly gets less. And so back to I am not going to discuss political problems or whatever in the comments. The only reason I'm bringing this up is for this current story. And there's definitely antiquated ways from like you know what antiquated means in the past that aren't good, and governments and societies that are less free and stuff like that. But forcing, like, this is a theme in Poppy Wars too, of like where the white people come in to like save these primitive people who are like they view as less than people and want to convert them to their god and their only ways of things, rather than encouraging them to like find solutions that like help them preserve their own culture, but also do offer more freedoms and kind of modernization without taking away their identity. Like, and the idea of like cultures getting along despite these differences and helping each other. So like, that's why I'm not fully against having like white saviors. I mean, also, I think that whole thing, I can't, trope, I guess, of the white savior coming in is just a natural like step in the progress of, you know, more realization for, you know, people of color and stuff, or LGBTQ community. Like, yeah, it sucks that there were stories that like the white people had to save the black people or whatnot. It's just a natural progression of getting to where we need to be. I feel like I can't give the full idea of what I would do with this third book without kind of getting into this. But I hope you kind of understand what like my approach would be if I were to, you know, do this. And not just with this book, but within my own series is what I would do. And kind of what I would suggest for you guys to do is explore kind of that kind of stuff and just be aware of what kind of, I don't want to say biases, what's the word? Of like the pattern, the cycle of how this works. Like, you got to be very careful, especially since this one is, again, ripe with possibilities of ways to misrepresent a lot of things. So it's yeah, a struggle, but I'm willing to do the struggle, especially within this video of me, you know, struggling to say this because I do think it is still important. And I'm not struggling because I don't want to like offend anyone. I just want to make sure I represent my ideas the right way and say the right words, because there's a lot of negative connotations with different words. Like, if I were to say, oh yeah, I'm like, I do judge people, but that doesn't mean, it's like the amount of like, how much do you judge them? How much do you rely on your judgment of them? How much can you change? Because we have to make judgments of people every day to know whether or not we're safe, to know whether or not we're accepted, to know if they're lying to us. Just, you know, stuff like that. So like, I do judge people, but I don't do it in the way that a lot of the connotation on that word is for a lot of other people. So that's, hopefully that made sense. I'm keeping it in, even if it didn't, in the hopes that it would. I hope you can see the new dynamics and some details it could lead to, because I'm not going to get too into it here as to like exactly how I'm going to do it. Back to the fanfiction thing. If you are trying to make a series similar to another one, again, don't just copy and paste ideas, but also, rather than just reading comments and reviews of said series, maybe go and see what some of the more popular headcanons and fanfictions there are and what kind of like fandom essentially this series creates. Because there's another series that like I have mixed opinions on. Like, I don't want to point out a specific one, but there are communities, especially with like shipping wars and stuff going on, that it gets super toxic. And so you got to be careful. Again, it's this whole thing. Publishing is probably way harder. Like, I do not envy publishers this stuff to worry about. And what environment like the fandom has. Because there are some like series or like fandoms or content that they're fine, but then you get to the fandom and there's a lot of toxicity in there. And it may be worthwhile to try and find where that's coming from, where that's stemming from, and study how the creators respond to that and how that response was taken by the community. Like, it's this whole thing. And if you're an indie publisher, you do have to like do all that yourself. So while I haven't read any fan fiction about the Turtle universe recently, I did read a few in high school, because again, there's not that much. Oh, not as much as I wanted. I probably read a lot. It's just there wasn't as much as I wanted. So there's definitely more room for adult-like things within this series. And I don't just mean adult fun times. I mean like adult topics like war and death and conflict and stuff like that. One girl in a later Turtle series even ends up being sold as a slave in a different country despite being a noble in the one she lives in. So like it's already kind of in her series that there's adult stuff going on and like kids getting sent out like pages to like stop these grown adults in a war. Like, there's just so much happening. And going into this, when I was working on this, I didn't realize how much like Poppy Wars it was. But it's not, there's similarities, but it's not super like Poppy Wars. It's just the general themes of war and stuff. And I know that's everywhere, but just the other things, like the political kind of commentary and whatnot, is reminding me of Poppy Wars. I say however here, after saying despite being a noble. More of not just romance, but relationships in general is something that applies to the series, as well as deeper lore and more expansive world building. So this is stuff that happens. Like I read one with a different series main character, and they do lean more into the adult stuff, and it is one of the, I shouldn't say adult stuff, the more war related gritty stuff, and it's one of the more popular ones. At least it was then. It was like number 1 or something. Also, all of this is more widely accepted now because like we can handle it, whereas before it was so hard to get like the young adult literature because it was either children's story or like adult stories. There was no in between. And now most, I don't want to say most, but a good deal of what we have now is the in between. And it's not just accepted, but it's sought after. People are looking for this. So there still needs to be the right balance of ingredients and dealing with the ingredients in the right way. And again, that's just going back to like all the political stuff I was going on in my mind of what kind of topics would I explore. And another thing to do is maybe one person gets it, like has all this stuff happen to them and comes to this conclusion. But to show that you're not fully endorsing that conclusion, despite it being the natural progression for this character, you could have a foil character who goes through a lot of similar stuff and comes to the opposite conclusion. Stuff like that. That's another way you could go about this. So if you want an analogy for the right, like the ingredients and then the way to mix them together, is I was making snickerdoodles once, and I'm trying to think of how long. It's been several years since I had made cookies of any kind. And so when they said soften the butter, I just melted it completely. And so while the cookie still tasted nice, the experience was dimmed because the texture of the cookie was like Play-Doh. It was not good. It was not good. I still ate them all though. I would have enjoyed it a little more if the texture was right. With that said, this also applies to how we will be separating these points of view. And I did get into Tom and Jonathan, but now I'm getting more into just Tom. So what way can we have more of Tom without him taking up too much space at the beginning? And especially because his story doesn't directly affect Alana's story. Like, you know, at least until they split. Like, it's a flex, so they split. But then after that, they're living completely different lives. The solution is, you know, them exchanging letters. She is getting letters from him, or at the very least, if we don't get her reaction to them, we get Tom's point of view while he's writing the letters, and we'll get into why I feel like that might be effective later. So the letter thing already happens a bit in the book, and it's meant, you know, it's like mentioned, but we'll show more of it happening. And there will be more letters at the get-go, but as time goes on, the letters become less frequent as they both get used to their new lives. So what I first thought of here is already with the idea of Tom having less and getting more, what are ways I can show that? And just show him as like a character. Like, it's not just progressing, but there's also like regressing. I think I was going to mix those words. So maybe there will be a point in time where Tom is kind of forgotten about. I thought of it while I was reading it. I'm just going to read it. I forgot what I was going to say. So there'll be more letters at the get-go. But as time goes on, the letters become less frequent as they both get used to their new lives, get distracted by interests, make new friends, or even something more sinister, like somebody's actively meddling with their letters. That last one is not likely, but I'm just leaving it in there as a possibility in case I decide, like I finish this draft and I decide, okay, I need a little more conflict, or I need to tie this in with this, and having this meddler in there could tie it together. And my proposition is maybe it's Alana who is falling through and writing back more frequently, so Tom starts to feel more abandoned, which will come into play later on in the series when he supposedly brings a villain back to life. So after all, Alana is out there doing all these great things without him and living this life without him, that like it distracts her from, you know, talking to Tom. And they're twins, and they lived like a whole life together, entertaining each other in, you know, their home. In the original series, he's progressing through mage training faster than everyone thought possible, and we could just have this be a thing, it'll just be delayed. So in the original, it just seems like, oh, these are just two talented kids, you know, like it's in their blood. And maybe it is in their blood, but somebody just needs a bit more pushing to do that. But the pushing doesn't come in the healthiest of ways. So for Tom, it's out of a desire, he's progressing out of a desire to not be left in his sister's dust, whereas she is developing fast and working hard because she just wants to, and she's fulfilling her dream, whereas he's just trying to keep up to her because he doesn't want to be that like other twin, you know, like something like that. It doesn't have to be exactly like full hatred or anything. It could just be like that nudging thing. Anybody who knows like siblings know how you can harbor those kind of grudges but still like get along and love each other as siblings. So to merge this, at first Elena is doing far better, but at least by the end of book 2, Tom is starting to catch up. So he's struggling throughout book 1. And then in book 2, he'll start having the development of eventually deciding to do this application, or maybe he's challenged in some way. And then he starts pushing, and then we do get back to the original series where he is excelling. But it's just not for the right reasons. Even if he doesn't know his reasons. Like, maybe he comes to a different conclusion of this is why he's doing it, but like through his actions and through like his, emotions and like stuff like that, people know it's not that. Or at least can figure it out. And then another thing to fuel this whole plot point is Tom is starting to catch up, and it may not be fully recognized or appreciated by Elena due to her own aversion to magic at that time. So let's say he's able to like show her something, like maybe there's like this mage festival or whatever that Tom ends up going into. And since Elena has her own beef with magic that she has to go through because she doesn't want to use her magic because she thinks that's cheating, seeing Tom like be, at least semi-good at magic, he's not getting Elena's like full support because she, has her own issues. Like it's like miscommunication, misconceptions there, even though like there is some Tom valid viewpoints, but overall he takes it too far. That happens. Especially when you're depressed, you just tend to go on this spiral and things just stack up and then they just get worse. Like it's this whole thing. So this will provide more sympathy and interest and investment in Tom's character, and will make what happens with this plot have more of an impact. Spoiler alert, he does die because that's necessary to kill the villain. End of spoilers. So as fun as it would be to get into a detailed chapter version of this, not happening. But you can see why it's kind of exciting for me to do, even though it's like a lot of work and a lot of like balancing this or that. I don't have time with it. So that's all I have really for this, is because in order for me to kind of know more of how I would do book 4 or book 3, I would have to like do it based off of what I was doing in book 1 and 2. And since I'm not getting into that, it's just not happening. So it's just going to end abruptly like that. But you are introduced to enough stuff that I do feel it's not too jarring of a end. Okay, next up is the Graceling Realm series. Okay, so in book 1, I'll just be doing a brief summary of what each book introduces us to. So we are introduced to a world where people who have 2 differently colored eyes have a power called a grace. The usefulness and broadness of every grace fluctuates, and the powerfulness of it and ability range can increase in some cases, likely due to using it and practicing it like a skill. So it can be things like knowing when someone is lying, having a strong sense of smell, knowing what the weather will be, which could maybe evolve into like having a bit more control over the weather. Who knows? Probably not that big, but so it develops after birth. So one day your kid's eyes may change color, and it isn't just one eye, but both. These babies with graces are essentially the crown's property, and they decide if they're useful enough to serve the throne in some way, or if they can go back home because they're too useless. In book 2, we are introduced to a world beyond the Graceling one, a country across the mountains, and with people who don't have these graces, but rainbow, like colorful monsters and okay, so they're both called monsters. So monster animals and monster people. And who can influence your mind, though the people are very rare. Like there's only 2. So these animals use it to entrance a human, so the animal would have an easier time killing them. And these people are essentially prey to both humans and monsters, especially if you're female. Since your unique beauty will bring about unwelcome attention and advances, and monsters can smell blood and long for human flesh. But luckily and unluckily, the monster people can influence minds and protect themselves or use it to harm. We also learn an origin story here from someone who is important in Graceling. So that's the connection. Even though they're 2 different things, it's not the origin story. He's just part of the story, and it happens to be his origin story. So it's not about this person. Yeah. So in book 3, we are primarily in the Graceling realm again, and it ends up teasing how these 2 countries will come together and deal with the fallout of what they both went through in their respective novels. So it's a nice end to this trilogy, even though it's not the typical long-form type trilogy. But don't think that's like what this book is about. I don't want to like sell this as something it's not. It's primarily in the Graceling realm with hints towards the other one. So the book isn't about these 2 nations coming together. There's just hints of that happening in the future. Because it's not really about that at all, even though there are hints throughout it of the effect of the other country. Hopefully you could hear that. I just realized I was mumbling. So in book 4, we are introduced to a country across the sea. Where the previous countries were still in medieval times, this new country is in its industrial era, and has been for some time. A lot of people found the difference jarring. While the story of what happened in the previous trilogy is continued, I think it did miss its mark, because it's kind of barely, like, it was, the idea was mostly about this world, and they're like, oh, let's tie it into this world, and so that's kind of the feeling you get. And I do think I read something of, that is what happened, is that Kristen Cashore wanted to write a series about this, but then she also wanted to explore more of the world in this other realm, and so she just turned it into Best of Both Worlds. So not only did we get the difference in setting, but also in how the story was told. Books 1 through 3 were told from a single person's point of view. This one has multiple. The main female character is also the kind of character people will naturally dislike through bias alone, though there are unbiased reasons to dislike her. All of this makes for a book that may as well be a different series/world, since it has a completely different feeling and introduces new things rather than getting into the things where there was already a built-up interest, the revolutions against the monarchy. So, like, another thing is that there was a significant time gap between the old trilogy and these new books. And so you're banking on people who grew up with these other books to want to read these books and finally get, like, into the stuff that we were waiting for, and then not getting into it. It's just a background mention. In book 5, we then go back to having a single person point of view, which makes the difference in book 4 even more jarring. And we have a character who was in the previous trilogy, the last book. And again, it just makes Winterkeep just seem all that more like otherworldly and different and stuff. So, but book 5, it says so in the summary, so it's not really a spoiler. But it takes place in a frozen, like, wasteland wilderness, like on a ship that gets shipwrecked, and then the wilderness, trying to survive in the wilderness. It's, if, like, a lot of that stuff is factually accurate, it's probably a good way to learn how to survive in that kind of environment. And to learn about this character, because that's essentially what it is. I do think it misses mark. There's a lot of good stuff and, like, good things that the author did, but I do think it could have been fine-tuned a little more. Also, where book 4 didn't have a long-lasting love-type romance, like with book 3, this one has the beginning of a love. Book 5 has the beginning of a love interest of some kind, but I didn't like it because it seemed like he was more of, like, a prop than a person. But I did like how he wasn't integral or, like, an anchor kind of thing of her development. So, like, she's developing on her own, and then she turns to this guy. So, like, I do kind of like that aspect of it, but I do wish we had learned more of who the love interest was, and that he wasn't just there for love interest. Cashore could have just kept the multiple point of view thing and say it would be that way for this trilogy, but I do think, I didn't do a whole lot of research on this because it wasn't a video I was going to go in depth with, and even with the research, I'm going to be pretending this kind of stuff is happening anyway, so it's whatever. Do your own research. I think Cashore went back to a single person due to the complaints of book 4, when really the biggest problem, I mean, granted, the multiple point of view, the way she utilized it in book 4 wasn't great. What happened was, instead of these added point of views, like adding, I mean, some of them did, but most of them did not. It didn't add to the story being told or enhancing it. It just was a continuation of this character's relationship from a previous trilogy that Kristen Cashore, I think, she realized she missed out potential on these two characters coming together and wanted to show that in this series. And so she was finishing that up here, when if she wanted to do that, she could have just done, like, short stories versus, like, mixing it in with this story because it didn't really fit. It's this whole thing. But ultimately, it's the multiple points of view, the way it was handled, but also the jarringness of the setting all playing a part. So, like, if the setting thing wasn't there, maybe the point of view thing would have been less of a problem, or vice versa. Maybe you get rid of the POV and had the setting. Oh, and one thing I say here, because I kind of want to get into this, is that, like, having these other two characters, like, and one of them was a main character from one of the previous stories here. And so to me, that's, like, insulting to this current character that we're trying to, like, get to know and root for, and, like, when we have this other character that we're more interested in, like, it's insulting because she doesn't really get, insulting might not be the right word. With all this said, what are we going to pretend to do about it? Here is a list of options. Option 1, have both books and potentially the third book. So this is if I can go back in time and like change what happened. So have both books and potential third in the new trilogy be told from different points of view and just fix up the other issues with them. So this means rewriting Sea Sparrow, book 5, the same as book 4. So we'd have to find a way to enhance Sea Sparrow's story with multiple points of view. However, this leads to option 2 because I don't like that. And it's not just because I don't like multiple points of view from the first one, it's that trying to tell Sea Sparrow, which is even more of a character like set journey, character driven plot, it's like, again, it would be insulting to this character to have her story be interrupted by these other things. And I just, especially with how much I'm glad that this character got their own book, having it interrupted by these other characters. And with the way, I don't know, and just with how Chris and Kashor did it the first time, I'd rather not even pretend that it happened in this one either. Even though I do have problems with not a lot of it, but like a good deal, enough with what happened in Sea Sparrow. So option 2 would be changing Winterkeep to fit a single point of view, without certain exceptions. I'll get into those exceptions later. So as those could just be told, and again, in a short story collection with the expansion of the two characters' relationship and other ones that we are waiting for. So what we need to do is find a way to make the lead female someone the readers would be more likely to root for and learn to love. And this is the main female in Winterkeep. Because she's not one I connected with a whole lot, but I do have the approach of, oh, let me learn how this person works kind of thing. Like, to me, it's just another different kind of journey. So those are two different things that could like help inspire you if you wanted to like have like a little project to work on and get those gears moving. Is, well, how would you make Sea Sparrow into a multiple point of view type of book? What angle would you use? And then for Winterkeep, what would you do how would you make it a single point of view? Those are two options you can do. But for the moment, for me, I'm pretending we aren't able to go back in time, as if, we could have done that and make those changes. So we have to salvage what we have. And I put those in quotations, because a lot of people think that would be offensive because they don't think there's anything to salvage because they think it's a really good story. So how could we solve these issues with, I say book 3, but it's technically book 6. While little can be done to fix the change in point of views, since no matter what is chosen, one book will be the outlier. So we can't, by that, I mean, no matter what book 6 is, book 4 or 5 would be the outlier. So within this trilogy, at least. So if book 6 was told in multiple points of view, book 5 wouldn't like add up to it. And it's kind of like, so far it's gearing up to be like a trilogy, kind of like the first one was. So whereas like if book 6 had a single point of view, then again, book 4 would just be even more of an outlier. So no matter what you do, you're kind of having that problem there. And then if you were to do what I was doing before of changing the amount of points of view in each book, if you one of them is adding a point of view, you could have those points of view, like it'd be easier to implement them into your own works because, that's essentially all your idea. You just have to change the location, the setting, and the plot and stuff like that. So like, again, this is a good way to generate those ideas. And other ways of implementing other POVs without actually having other points of view is like with journal entries, letters, dreams, or mind reading, because there are graces that can do that. Now I'm thinking like the fox, there's these mind reading foxes in this second trilogy, and it would be interesting to see if that could be implemented, is having these other points of view through the point of view of these other foxes telling us about the other person's point of view. It might not be good. It's just something to consider. Another option I considered briefly for this is to have the 6th book serve as both a sequel and a prequel to the new trilogy, but discarded it quickly. So essentially taking what my plan was of having this be a sequel to the previous trilogy, but prequel to these new trilogy, I was going to do like at the end, it's only for like this new trilogy. It's confusing. I'm sorry. This is the one I was the most worried about, but it's also the hardest one to like come up with the right words for. Because my goal is to have a bridge and create a 3rd or 6th book that could actually be the 4th book. So if people read the first trilogy, they could read this new one that hasn't been published yet, and then read the rest of this stuff. The rest of the other 2 books, whatever. I do go into explaining a bit how we could do the both as a sequel and prequel for the last trilogy, and here are some ideas. I'm just throwing them out there again for it to hopefully inspire you with your own stuff. But one way is through flashbacks, but that's an obvious answer. How can we diverge from that or make flashbacks more interesting than what we usually get? While this is an unusual structure for the series, since it's mostly one person's point of view and it's like linear, and there are no like flashbacks, we could have 2 different timelines that seem like they're the same for a while. So this is if it's the prequel and sequel for only this series. So it would be a story that's happening in between. Like, one of the stories is serving as my goal of the between the 2 things of what leads this to that. And the other timeline is after. And then they end up meeting and merging because of certain things. It's hard to try to explain. The best way I could do it without struggling is through a story, but I don't have that ready. Okay, and then so we think these 2 stories, though, are from the same timeline, but we learn that they're not. And then a character from the past timeline is a recurring or passing character or like important somehow to the current timeline. And one way it may fit in is because, like with Winterkeep, it does something different. So instead of forcing only one book to be the outlier, there will be another one. It's kind of the thing of like with art. If you make a mistake, just make more of it, and then it looks like it's intentional. So for flashback-wise, or it doesn't have to necessarily be flashback-wise, but it could also work with the timeline thing, maybe. But we could have a character's past come back to haunt them, not just mentally, but physically. We could also do a different version of a whodunit, only more as a does this person deserve what happened to them, whether what happened to them is good or bad. I won't get into it, but hopefully it will inspire you again in some way without me needing to get into it. Oh, and I guess that's it. One reason why I cut these off abruptly, it isn't just because this is all I had planned. It's because trying to get further into it, again, I need to there's so many possibilities that I need to have a basis of like things to follow. And I can't contain it all within a small video of trying to get through all that stuff. So I just stop it. So that's the end of Graceling. Surprised me because I thought there was at least one more slide, but I guess not. So one big complaint I did not have is Rin as the main character. A lot of people had that complaint, mostly women. Because Rin is not like a person, they can cheer on. And I also saw, I'll get into that later. I also saw some reviews say they didn't like how YA the first part of book 1 felt, nor how it was split up the way it was. Halfway through, it was suddenly changed. Again, I'll get more into that later. But I can still think why people would think that, because a big selling point of this is it is like a dark and gritty kind of fantasy. So that usually means like they want full adult and they want adults experiencing this, not kids. And for both of those, like more specifics of like Rin and the YA thing, usually I try to make these rewrites about catering to these complaints, but this time I'm doing the opposite. I'm leaning more into what these people complain about. Because for me, I think it perfectly encapsulates the author's goal in telling the story. So this one I did end up doing more research in, because it was going to be one I was going to do earlier, and so I had more done with it. But the author was inspired by the Ender's Game and putting children in these positions of power and how absurd that is. And so while there were flaws in the execution, it's just another case of needing more developmental editing, substantive, whatever, before publishing, and like beta reading too, not just developmental editing, but sometimes beta readers can be more helpful. I do think it deserves the recognition it gets, so long as people are careful about how they hype it up. And I'm not just leaning into these complaints because of R.F. Kuang's like whole thing. Like, it's definitely an added plus, but what made the decision is just my personal experience with it. I will get into it a little bit, like you'll kind of understand what I say about it. One thing I do wish, so this is my biggest complaint of things that like could have been done differently, aside from pacing, is that we get more of the mythology we were introduced to. I would call it barely fantasy. I mean, the fantasy aspects do become important, but also like it is based on a historical thing, so already we know it could have been done without the fantasy stuff. But like, I'm also a big fantasy nerd, so I would have liked to see more fantasy. But it's also like not like a big complaint, because it's also due to the setting. It's set in a time period where it's like more of like almost more like a pre-modern, like it's getting there. All of the big fantasy mythological stuff happened in the past and it's just now being rediscovered. So like, I understand why I couldn't get fully immersed into this Asian fantasy setting, but at the same time, it's kind of a complaint I have. I do think we could have had more sense of loss if we had more stuff from the past to like feel of what could have been, kind of thing, is essentially my view. And another thing about the rediscovering it and the happening in the past is that it was only barely being rediscovered in the present due to poor preservation and active purging of that information. So again, like there's really good reasons for it to be missing that stuff. It's just, especially with what happens later, I do want more of a sense of loss of that stuff. And I do think the only way to do that is to have more of what could have been, even if it does just, instead of like answering questions, it just brings more of certain kinds of questions, because you don't want to do it a complete, not give anything. But I'm going to just stop there. I can keep talking about that for a while. So back to Rin as the main protagonist. Why she is hated mostly by like females is because she is not like a strong female like representative that women want. Part of it is because of spoilers. She gets her period and she does surgery so she doesn't have to deal with her period. And a lot of, she's also just, not a cheer-worthy character for the most part. And so we can't cheer for her. And then she's also having like this whole, the whole conversation with like womanhood right now. Like she actively gets rid of something that makes her a woman in a lot of people's mind. And instead of just dealing with it, like what we have to do. So I don't have a problem with this, with how Rin was portrayed at all. Not all females in stories need to be the perfectly good-hearted and noble person doing all the right things to make us modern women be able to relate to her or want to emulate her or, any of that jazz. Yes, having a relatable character is important, and I'll get into my solution for this later. But I find having characters who challenge your perception and introduce you to new ways of thinking and being, even if they're unhealthy, is equally important. But I'm not saying Rin's decision to do that was unhealthy. I say this in my Alana part, but female-led YA fantasy was my jam, and I got so bored from it because of how similar a lot of those stories were. So imagine if we keep reading the same stories over and over again. They're just repeating the same belief systems, the same, events over, like characters over and over and over again. So it's not just like my own views on this kind of stuff, but like in general, as a consumer, like, don't you want more variety? I mean, I guess some people don't because they just want their whatever to be reinforced, or they're just in a certain mood. But for the most part, variety is a good thing to have. So, there's a conversation about this already of like strong female doesn't necessarily mean like, like big buff, take everything on female, but it also doesn't have to mean a good female. Like females can be equally bad, like strong and bad. And that's, like, it's just life. People are people. And just because an author has a character do certain things does not mean they're endorsing that behavior or saying you should emulate that behavior. It's just, I know, it's like with actors, people tend to not be able to, not everybody, but like see the actor versus the character. Like they just think the actor is the character. It's this whole thing that some people do that just does not make sense. The point of the book is not for Rin to be sending these kind of political messages. It's to explore this, like what if this person in history was this kind of person? What kind of choices would they make? And so this is just reflecting Rin as a character, the choices she would make. If Rin was writing, if Kwong was writing about someone else, maybe she would have dealt with it because maybe this person, for some reason, does want to have kids eventually. Like it's just a character thing. I'm going to stop there because, again, I can talk about a lot of this for a long time, trying to just hopefully get what I want to say out in a way that you can understand it. Again, without going into too much detail, I'd make the beginning of the book where she is hating her life and training to get into the academy. So they do this test thing to get into the academy, which is realistic to what like the Chinese have to go through this big major test that like decide their whole life. But so during that arc, before she even gets to this war school, it's not even like a full war school. It's just something that can happen in there. And we are more immersed into Rin's world and have more reason to cheer her on in the beginning. So those are the two goals. And I'm going to be like skipping words and stuff because I don't have air conditioning and it's getting really hot in here. And I'm exhausted, but I'm doing this today anyway because it's the only time I have for a while to do it. I mean, I could force myself to make time. I'm just not going to. So one thing I want to say with my personal experience is my expectation going in. I am a peacemaker and a mediator kind of person. So when the book cover says Rin seeks to end the war, I thought it was going to be something different. And I was worried the whole time. Because she kept increasingly like making decisions and having these thought processes that I'm like, no, that's not leading to this. Like, this is not the best way to be thinking about this. And like, that was always there. Like even like, as it became more and more clear that she wasn't the kind of character I was going in thinking she was going to be, for some reason, I kept looking at it through that lens. I think it's because I might have been, like, in a point in time where, like, I was hoping to read about that kind of character to, like, potentially, like, inspire me in my own life and stuff like that. So, like, yeah, that was my experience with it. And then the ending happened. But by then, like, I had some idea of what was going to happen. I just thought maybe it would be, like, a longer journey. So, like, I was accepting that she was going to start going down first. But then I thought she would go up. But, yeah, did not happen. Oh, other things. This is why I have a script. So I knew it wasn't likely going to lead to good things and didn't know what to think about it, but kept hoping something would change. She would learn, or someone would step in, or something would happen and she would be saved from herself. Like, again, that's the kind of story I thought would be happening. However, I do like that it is a theme that was actually addressed in the book, is she goes to, like, spoilers, but she, like, talks to this one person. It's like, why weren't you there for me? Like, you could have saved me from this. Maybe not exactly like that, but, like, you could have helped me through this. But there was nobody to, like, help guide her, really. And it was mostly, like, kids, like, because she goes to the psych after learning about her abilities rather than, like, under one of other people that, like, I don't know, it's, the psych is, like, all people, like, her age or younger, and yeah, the frustration of, like, this, I feel it a lot. And it's one of those books where, like, I felt this with His Fair Assassin, like, Courting Darkness or whatever. It did so well of, like, getting emotion out of me, but it was, like, the anger or, like, the annoyance or, like, the kind of emotions that, like, I want to reread it, but I don't want to get into that mindset again. I repeat again that despite all those complaints, I am leaning into Rin not representing the strong female people want to relate to. I am leaning into making that betrayal or twist more jarring, so people are more horrified about what she does because of her trauma and being heavily influenced by a spirit of vengeance. So my goal is to make the betrayal or twist of Rin's, like, not being a good person to emulate, like, that twist to be more jarring and horrifying. With all that said, again, leaning more into Rin being... Also, I said this, where was it? I don't remember which other of the books in this video I said it about. But remember when I talked about, like, the betrayal of, like, the reader, of, like, tricking them into thinking they're reading one thing, but it ends up being about another? I'm going to be doing that here, is I'm going to be tricking them. But also, you're going to have to do it in a way where, like, it has been foreshadowed for the people who would catch on to that stuff. Essentially what I'm doing is leaning more into that betrayal or twist of character, of expecting Rin to be this one thing, but she's not. And I don't think the author was doing that. And it's mostly based on my own experience, because it made me realize how cool I was just affected by my own personal bias, which happens to, reflect, mirror, kind of, the whole white savior thing that comes in because of this white colonization that's going to be happening. And due to, like, this religion, and that, like, you know, mirrors Christianity and stuff, which is the religion I grew up in, even though I'm not about it now. Like, I don't believe in one religion. I get into this a little later, but essentially, Rin is heavily influenced by trauma and, like, the spirit of vengeance that, like, and it just keeps getting reinforced. Like, she doesn't have any time to work through things. She just keeps getting thrown into things. And so she has no time to heal. And so she just spirals downward. It's a journey. It took me, like, 3 weeks to read the whole series. And usually, like, it would take me probably, like, a week to read the whole thing. So to do the foreshadowing thing for the people who would catch on to it is to give, well, not just that, but, you know, just to make it more apparent that Rin is affected negatively by these things, and maybe it could have happened differently if she had more support system, if she had more time, if she had, like, somebody else to rely on to, like, help her through this, which she, like, most of the time did not have. So I would give Rin more opportunities to try and get into that diplomatic peacemaking mindset. And for it to be done in a way where we think it is what the end game of the book is. Again, I'm essentially, with this, forcing, like, my whole experience of it onto others. But again, this is fake, so it's fine. And, you know, if I were to write my own book, I'd probably do it anyway, but whatever. So the end game of the book is that she will finally do it. She'll finally make peace with this and stuff. But she doesn't. So, and then what happened in book 1 will happen, and people will be unable to stop thinking about it for the rest of their lives, and their whole perceptions would be altered. And when they read through it again, if they miss the signs, they would see it through a completely different lens of realizing just how inevitable it was. Damn. This is why there's a script. So that's a big ask, but that would be my goal. I would also like to envision people going through it again to see just what went wrong and what would have happened if this or that changed, both of which would provide serious fanfic and video essay and article writing fodder, which would help keep the love of the series alive long past its prime, as people coming up with these theories, again, of what would happen if this happened or that happened. Like, you have to do it in a way to try and promote that, and maybe find ways to promote that yourself of like, hey, challenge day, what do you think would happen like this, like discussion boards, Reddit, whatnot, like ask those questions. Also, before she gets to school, I would have her attempt at a growth arc that has something to do with Kasegi, and we would get more of him, her brother, essentially, and their relationship, so when she leaves it, it's more heartwarming. Originally, I pictured the scene of her, like, leaving him to, like, originally be portrayed as, like, people, like, leading people to think Rin is just shoving down her emotions because there are too many, or she just, like, she's trying to portray her in a more good light. But then when you reread it, you realize, like, oh my god, how do I explain this? What we're trying to bank on here is people's perceptions of, like, the dots they would be connecting. So when they're seeing the way we explain Rin reacting to this by, like, not reacting or not being as, like, heartwarming or, like, lovey, huggy with it, we would try to engineer it so that the readers would be thinking it's because Rin just has trouble expressing that stuff, she's shoving it down and whatnot. But on the reread, people would realize they just weren't there in the first place, and that we were projecting our own stuff onto her when, you know, that wasn't the kind of character who she was. However, I ended up deciding I couldn't do that with this series because later on I decide that I want to show Rin as, like, a more goodish person who has hope, because we want the readers to keep trying to root for Rin. So first they'd be rooting for her, like, as just a normal hero thing, and then they'd be rooting for her, like, recovery. Like, they want her to recover, they want her to do this. And so we have to find a way to, like, again, make people root for Rin for a reason, and the only way to do that is to not make her, like, a sociopath. I shouldn't say that, I don't know what actual diagnosis would be, but to make her be, like, that kind of evilish, not kind of person from the beginning. You know what I mean? So, like, there was potential of her becoming a good and noble leader, and we want her to get there, but she keeps going away from there. So even when she's making these choices, we still want her to make good choices, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's like the best thing for her. That's already happening a little bit, and I'll get into reasons of how I would, like, expand on that later, because there is a lot of the stuff I'm talking about that is in there. It's just, again, the presentation is a problem for me. So, but either way, even if we were to do it the other way, or this one, ambiguity as to her character would be key. So, because we want to generate this discussion behind it, especially since it's kind of a politically, like, sound novel and, like, historical stuff. You want, like, it's a book that people could, like, read for, like, literature, like, playgrounds, stuff like that. Like, that's essentially the goal, is to make it a book that we have, like, discussions about it. Like, I read, what was it? Wicked. So I already went into Wicked knowing it wasn't going to be like the musical. I still kind of like, what the F did I just read? But at the back of their book, they have, like, a bunch of, like, series of questions of, like, if this was to be, like, a literary novel you read in, like, a class, of, like, what would do? Essentially that kind of thing we would want to generate with this story. So while what was really happening could be that Rin was a goodish person, we'd still want people to interpret it another way, like, to save room for people to interpret it another way. It's probably not even that hard. I'm just tired and overheating. So one way we could try to portray this ambiguity and kind of, like, false representation of her at first is, like, through dark humor. So, like, moments that are supposed to be kind of, like, more, like, horrifying or, like, kind of stuff would be played off humorously so that people would be kind of disturbed, but they'd also, like, laugh it off or, like, brush it off, like, anything to do, like, that, like, and then later on the reread, they'll be like, oh, there were signs all along. Another thing to get more relatability in characters is to just have more characters. So again, I'm proposing we have more points of view, even if it's not, like, a lot of, like, points of view, just enough to, like, have this alternate look. You'll see what I'm planning. Okay. So before I get to the points of view, though, I want to get into some added elements as to the school training arc. So after she gets into the school. And the structure I'm basing all these arcs on was going to be essentially each arc is treated as a short story, where it has its own like introduction, incident, rising action, climate, denouement kind of stuff going on, and then feed into like the next one. So the moment Rin makes her decision to go to school and goes to the school would be a bit more momentous, as well as how she dealt with her aunt after the fact. I would want it to be an inspiring and relatable series of events for the readers who may similarly feel stuck in poor conditions. Again, tricking people into rooting for her. But as for the momentousness of it, Kwang's writing is a bit dry. But rather than try to change the way she writes, I would add something that happens. That's why, like, I feel like part of the presentation is her prose, but I'm not, what are you going to do? Steal the story from her and give it to someone else to write? No. So what we need to do is just have more moments where that can be seen. And that's why I'm saying, like, going into all this stuff, even though we kind of have all this stuff, we just needed it more of it and kind of more into the scene versus like a description of just sequence of events. It was really weird. I have to read it again to be able to like describe it more better. Yeah. Rin already compares the differences of small town versus big town and later rich life versus poor life. Well, I won't try to think of it for this video. How would you portray something like that without it relating to prose? What series of events would send the message you want to send, and maybe how would you send it ambiguously enough to be interpreted in different ways? Because that's another thing that we have to learn with, like, not just descriptions, but like dialogue. And like, there's all these videos of like, what makes good dialogue and what makes a good scene. It essentially has like 4 different aspects to it. Like, it's not just a throwaway scene because it connects to this. It shows this. It has to do with that. It's a callback to that. Like, there's a lot happening within a single scene. And that's essentially what we're trying to emulate, but it's a little different. But it's the same kind of concept. So, moving on. Essentially, we wouldn't need to add another subplot/conflict since she already has many in the school to face. There may be a few alterations here or there, and maybe a few changes. But overall, it'll stay the same. And with my goal, I would just try to find ways, again, through action and events, to make us more immersed in the environment and invested in the conflict. Not just more events, but more portrayal, like a better portrayal of the events. So with my goal, it would be trying to get Rin to chill just a little and not think of everything in a single combative way. While there would be the physical conflicts, they are actually detriment to the message trying to be taught, which is already kind of shown through this tournament. There's this tournament where, like, before I get into the tournament, she has this instructor who like hates her guts, and her like student enemy is like a favorite of this teacher that also hates her. Like, they both hate her. And so she ends up fighting against this kid in the tournament. And, because usually how stories go is like that's supposed to be like a grand, glorious, yay, I did it kind of thing. But in this one, it's already kind of like bad because she's already being negatively affected by this certain just kind of hereditary thing she has that is like empowered when she fights like this and whatnot. Because again, like that whole spirits of vengeance thing, like it's just in her blood. It's also like, let's say with this tournament, we're trying to portray it in a less cheery way. Not like that, but we're trying to make it ambiguous. Oh my God. It's kind of already happening though. What I was about to propose is essentially that it's not a good thing she's able to defeat him because it leads to this. Like, she already kind of like loses control of herself at the end. And so it's already kind of portrayed as bad. The way it was told needs to be changed. So never mind. I'm not going to get into that because it technically already happens. It's just the portrayal. Essentially, the main changes I would add to this arc isn't actually from Rin's point of view, but the added point of views. While the home training could have some added point of views as well, I'm going to focus on the ones here at the school since they're essentially going to be the same thing. And this is a teacher's/mentor/master's hope for this current generation and future generations. So, like, it doesn't need to be like Rin teacher. It could be like beginning, it starts with the teacher, end, it ends with the teacher. Beginning, it starts with the teacher, or like middle phase. It doesn't have to be a lot, just enough to like get more of a outside of Rin's view. And we can learn more about other characters outside of Rin's narrow perception of the world. So hope for generation and future generations. It is seeing how bright these young people are and seeing the potential for a finally stable country that could defeat their enemies. Because they're still recovering from the past war, which led very devastating effects to this whole like society. And it's part of the reason why they're developing so slowly is because they're still dealing with the fallout of that. But these people have already been through one war, and they are now worried about another war potentially coming to fruition. They're hoping the training they did not receive They're hoping the training they did not receive with these youths will be the deciding factor in their favor when the war starts. So primarily, they're just hoping to hold it off just a little longer, though they know it is inevitable. Seeing these kids through the teacher's eyes would be a very interesting and unique and touching experience, especially since it is supposed to kind of be more of an adult book, like adult themes. Having maybe more adults in there as like characters would help with that, because again, we are leaning more into the main cast being a young adult cast, just in an adult world kind of thing. And so that's a way I could try to like cater to that one complaint, but also not. Having some of them, like the teachers, learn to root for Rin too would play well into my vision of this rewrite, which already happens, but then we would get to see like, more of it. And we could see like behind the scenes teachers like arguing and stuff, and we could get more lore introduced that way instead of just through lessons. And honestly, I do think this whole thing that I'm proposing, it does complement I almost said Quang, sorry, Kwang's vision and goal as well. So during this time, I would also try to find ways to incorporate more lore, as I said. It is a school setting, so naturally, the typical way that lore would be introduced. So granted, since it is natural, you would need to do it that way. But trying to find other ways to do it is probably good too, so it's not just the cliche. Because there are already like some cliches used, like Karate Kid cliches, Mulan cliches. I don't want to say cliches, just tropes. But like the weird master teaching you in ways that are very unconventional and don't seem like she uses a lot of things, and it's very easy to pinpoint what they are. But like, I'm not saying get rid of that. I mean, maybe some of them alter a little, but it's whatever. Essentially, the way it happens is not important for this video, but you could think of it for your own stories. Arc 3. So this is the arc within the original story. It takes place before even like the halfway point, but it's essentially halfway. So it still takes place at the school, but it is when the promise of war gets stronger and the teachers would try to quicken their training. And at the end of this, like it's only like a few chapters, and then the war starts, the battle at the school happens, and then, there's no more school. Because even if they did succeed, there's a war going on. So yeah. So Arc 3 still takes place at school, but is when the promise of war gets stronger, and the teachers would try to quicken their training. I'm going to say Arc 2 ends with this tournament, and Arc 3 starts with Rin's life improving after overcoming the previous obstacles, since she has more friends, or at least less enemies, since she has learned a lesson or two. So we have seen some progression. And maybe the mistake at the tournament leads to, her getting this. Like, it's probably parts of it are in the book already. But yeah, I'm just saying for this, I'm keeping to this. However, there is differences after, a lot more differences after this. So essentially, that's half the book we'd have to make up for within this school arc, because this all happens within the school then, and leading up to this battle at the end. And so again, like that's a worrying aspect of this, is how do we provide more content without it just being filler content? So there would definitely need to be some added stuff. Maybe more about like the rich and poor disparity. We got a little bit of that. Yeah, I'm not going to think about it. Okay. Originally, the battle at the school preparing for it starts on page 219 of 530. So again, it's not even halfway through, but it's almost. While it could symbolize their time at school being cut short and trying to turn, while it could symbolize their time at school being cut short, and it is like a thing I considered of like, maybe it is better for it to keep it like this, I ended up finding a solution, because there is importance to having that kind of symbolism in these kind of things. But overall, if it leads to the like negatively impacting the story because you want this one thing to happen, you gotta be flexible. But the reason, okay, I'm just gonna repeat what I said through the script. It's not exactly, but so if the arcs are solid enough and the overarching theme and conflict of Rin trying to become a certain person and to present her in a more heroic aspect at the beginning, this is a good ending that would likely lead to more people wanting to continue the series because they want to cheer Rin on more, instead of the ending that happens in the real one, which is more devastating and like horrifying. Like this one ensures that you're got people hooked onto the next one. Even though that one is like a hook kind of thing, you'll still have more people buying the second book because they're still hoping for that. Like you have the two different teams essentially of kind of customers or consumers, whatever you call them. And a way we could hold on to the symbolism I mentioned before is to make it seem like this series will go one way maybe a more typical fantasy plot, only for the war to come and take that chance, those opportunities and else away. So let's say they are going to start diving in and reintroducing this culture and stuff, and that's like the maybe arc 4, actually arc 3, and then the battle and stuff would be arc 4. But that is another plot we could add into this first book to, fill it out, is to find out more about this lore, go to like maybe ancient sites or something, learn more about this stuff, and think you're going to go on this quest to do this thing that, again, typical fantasy does. And then war comes and you can't do it anymore. So that is another way we could hold on to that symbolism without it negatively affecting the story. So granted, again, with the whole trickery stuff coming up of tricking people into not just buying, I mean, I guess it kind of is buying the second book, but also being invested in the story, it can go very poorly for plenty of people. But so long as there is enough foreshadowing and grimdark elements, the reader should know to expect the worst / for tragedies to happen. It's just depending on how you do it. But like with the Song of Ice and Fire and the Red Wedding, like essentially that kind of thing going on. Or Ned's death. So book 2, I would call The Burning God, which was originally book 3 in the trilogy. And it would end the way the original book 1 did. So that means I didn't think about this. Essentially, we'd have to find what to take out from the original book 2. It would be a whole, let's just say, it would be a whole lot of rearranging. It would be a headache. And maybe, I say this in here, but maybe book 2 doesn't end the way book 1 did, but how book 1 ended is within book 2. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay, never mind. Problem solved, hopefully. Because book 2 is essentially dealing with a lot of the fallout of what happened at the end of book 1 and like recovering from that. And so that is, again, if we're doing the whole arc short story kind of system, it does make sense to have like these stuff that seems like it could be the end of a book, just be the end of an arc. And then just have the real ending be, oh, yep. I remember how this book 2 ends. It would work. Okay, we're good. With me making this title be The Burning God and having the end, I'm trying to avoid spoilers. But what happened at the end? Do I spoil it? I get into it later. So essentially, if you read it and you understood that whole tangent I just went on, you could probably be able to figure out the kind of changes I'd be making, the kind of lore I'd be delving into, because also because of the title of the book, like, and just all the lore stuff. And overarching themes. There's going to be a lot of tragedy. A lot of trauma. So if you read it, you could likely guess what changes I would make, what lore would be explored, and what the overarching theme would be. If you haven't read it, I'll just say you should definitely do research into the war this book is based on, and you can at least get one of the events that happens in this book, because it is probably one you might want to be prepared for. And what Rin is able to do because of the fantasy aspect of the book, another thing that happens is way worse. In many ways, but not always, because it didn't really happen. So while I won't go into many details, I say that a lot. I do want to get into which points of view would influence the stories in the ways we'd want. Since we can't have the teachers all the way through the books, I am going to set a precedent of the point of views aside from Rin's changing. So like the people in book 1 with the extra points of view are not going to be repeated ever again, essentially. Is it something I would actually implement if this were like a real thing I was working on? Hard to say, but it narrows down the possibilities for a video like this, and I need that. So book 2, I would focus on the Sykes point of view, again, those gifted children that Rin gets thrown into. So this part is also very YA, seeming, at least on the surface, but they would still deal with the realities of war as per usual. So it would just be more devastating since we can see it through more eyes than just Rin, and have more people to cheer on and potentially lose and potentially like hate. So having their points of view would also provide foreshadowing into Rin's fall from heroic grace. She is not liked by many people, and having more of that and getting people to dislike these people, and getting the readers to dislike these people who do not like Rin, will give the readers more reason to cheer for Rin as they did in book 1. Because again, there's this whole going against the grain, like, because Rin does have darker skin and she's poor and stuff. She's constantly looked down on. And so it's just, again, just more fodder for being cheered on. However, they will go to realize the worries and general distrust and dislike were were well-founded in many ways. And again, they do the reread and be like, oh man, no, they called it. They were right. Oh man. Like, I don't know why I do things like that, but with the trying to portray this reader's reaction, I'm just keeping it. I'm just whatever. And again, there is legitimate reasons to cheer Rin on. It's just the reason, like, that list gets shorter as we go, or at least gets outweighed by the negative things. However, I will want to find a way to make the readers look forward to Rin's redemption as the series goes on. I mentioned that. So while they can't root for Rin in the usual heroic way, they can root for her in a typical bad guy turned good way. So she starts out as this like normal protagonist, and then she's like the anti-villain type of protagonist that, like, yeah. She's essentially filling multiple roles as in one person. And so again, this is where I realized, which likely means there would need to be more of Rin being a good person at the beginning, so my original want for that one scene would likely not be worth it, or fit well with the story. So again, it just, the way my mind works, I wasn't able to come to that conclusion. I had the idea that I would probably come to that conclusion, but I wasn't sure. But once I got to this point, I was like, yeah, there's no way I can do it the way I was hoping for at first. I'll just have to put it that somewhere else, you know? Find a different story to put that in. So book 3 would be the Dragon Republic, and would essentially be the same thing, save for like the other point of views, or points of view. And the added POVs would either be Neza, Kate, and Venka, again, other people Rin's age, or Viceroy and the other council members, other adults. The points of view for book 4 would either be Neza, Kate, and Venka, again, the kids, and Suji, or the Triad. Oh, and Suji. He is another one that comes up, but he's not from the original, like, school or whatever. So, or the Triad. Essentially, 3 people from the past Poppy War who are more present in this book and are responsible for a lot and have stories mirroring / acting as a foil to the current one. So now I have to decide on which ones to use, because there are so many possibilities within this. But rather than go like event by event and like waste all that time trying to be like, okay, this person could do this person could do that, let's look at it from a wide point of view. And to do that first is getting the essence of what I already have. So the ones I've decided on for the previous books already. Book 1 is optimistic adults hoping for the best for the kids. So like hoping for the best future. Book 2 is other kids navigating through the war. If book 3 is about pessimistic adults hating how these kids do things, that fits a pattern but has enough change to not feel repetitive. But if book 3 is about another group of kids navigating through the war, like book 2 was, it could get repetitive. And then if book 4 is about the kids navigating through the war, but this time as the leaders of either side of the war, now that fits a pattern, but has enough change to not feel repetitive. So by book 4, all these kids are now leaders. They don't necessarily have to answer to these adults. So that's how I ultimately came to this decision. So book 1, again, teachers. Book 2, YA psych group. Book 3, the council members of the war, like war effort team. And then book 4 is more kids Rin's age, but this time in places of power. And now they're in the roles that, like, maybe there's more content or something, or like an emphasis on the kids' view of like the adults' choices and why they're making these choices. And then when they're the ones making the choices, they're like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. Or they, stuff like that. However, this does pain me because of the vision I had when I was thinking of what the Triads story would like do, like what we would get from there. Granted, it is mostly through flashbacks. Or again, split timeline thing. But it's also very integral to the story. However, we do already get a lot of that within book 4. So it's not entirely necessary for them to have their own point of view. So I do have an easier time letting go of that. The pattern I'm talking about with this whole kids, adult, kids, adult, kids, adult, could also symbolize the whole cyclical theme of how violence and oppression works throughout the book. So again, it's just another way to provide the symbolism that the author might have been looking for. So in adding the 4th book with Neza's point of view could give us more insight into just what would happen after. Since Kwang did say she made the changes to the historical aspect she did because she wanted to imagine what a non-communist communized China would be. And then, I guess I should say this. So book 1, Poppy War. Book 2, Burning God. Book 3, Dragon Republic. Book 4, Drowning Faith. Because honestly, book 4 is kind of where Neza really shines as well. And where we're introduced to the fact that he does have this ability contrary to Rin's. So like, it's It's a really good series, like order of the series. All they get to see of, what Kwong wanted to like portray is through Rin's point of view, which is again very narrow, very limited. But I still love, like, in some ways, how it was shown and handled. Especially her reaction to the Western colonization. Like, that was where I felt the most sympathy and like just the most good feelings for her, and not just come on, Rin, do better. The points of view Kwong already wrote from Neza's point of view, so like those little things that we got, snippets, could also be implemented here. And so that's another reason why I decided Jotting Faith would be at the end versus like changing the plot so it's earlier or whatever, is because we could implement that here and it would fit very well. And so, less to rewrite. So even though we're not even rewriting it in the first place, we could also get a good sense of what his point of view would add to the story, and not just to like the events happening within the story, but what happens after the story. And it's a lot, especially with what goes down. I'm not going to go further into the series, but if you are interested in knowing what goes down, I will share it briefly. So here's where I go full spoilers. If you don't want to know, skip ahead, or just stop watching, I guess. But essentially, Rin gets the power of the burning god and uses it to destroy the whole country of the people who are invading. So, like, not even the soldiers that are invading, but the citizens from where they are invading. So, like, she's not even, like, solving the problem of, like, the soldiers currently, like, ransacking her home, just the potential of reinforcements, and then also the fact that this country keeps doing this to them. So, let's just kill them all. But it is done in, like, a moment. You kind of understand why she does it later. But that's the big thing I was talking around. In case, watching this, you do want to read it, but you don't want it to be fully spoiled. So Rin and Neza start out as enemies, and then she defeats them in the tournament. So that's who Neza is that guy. They then become friends, and then potential lovers, and then war enemies again. Not telling you how that happens, it just happens. So it also turns out, again, Neza has a god power of water, so he's got a water dragon, and she's got like a phoenix. And he can go toe-to-toe with her and even like defeat her because his is water and hers is fire, Rin ends up allowing herself to be killed after she's like going on this whole like mindset of essentially what Kwong thinks. Not what Kwong thinks this guy thought, but like trying to like emulate what he might have been thinking of why like trying to recall it like would be better communized with her as the soul head, because these people just keep making bad choices and they don't understand her vision and stuff like that. Like, so Neza sides with these Western colonizers, while Rin sides with like her own people. Like, she doesn't want to be colonized, because of these people who think they're better than everyone and have this blind faith in this single god. Again, Christianity. But despite all the bad that these people do, Rin has a hard time denying the good she does happen to see, like cleaner cities, more effective, and stuff like that. But it also takes. I'll get into it. Her choice is essentially to save her people, but her whole society / culture be erased if she sides with the colonizers, because all these changes they're making and improvements do not take into consideration their culture. They're trying to like force their culture onto these people, or hold on to what she does have, like the culture, and like hope for the best, but risk further suffering to rebuild the country in a way that lets them hold on to their ideals and culture, and not to give in to these people who see them as less than people. But that's the harder road. And a lot of people disagree with her. So she's finally, because, they just want to stop the suffering. So she's finally a leader in her society and looked up to by many, but then more people come in and try to tell her she's less than a person. So that's just the whole cycle. Again, patterns and cycles and stuff like that is just a main thing of this book or series. And I'm ending there. Again, I am interested in going more into these, but you can see probably why they would take so much time to like get into. And if there is interest in it, I will do it. But if not, then I'll just move on to the next thing. However, on that note, I have way less time to work on this. So at the least, it will take 2 months to get the next video out. Or like 2 or maybe 3 months like between videos or something. Just so it doesn't have to cut into my like stress and productivity free time. As in free from that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's what I have. Let me know if... I know this one might be a little confusing. I hope you still understood it. But I don't have time to like redo it. I have this limit, like time limit of if I can't get this out by this time, it's more likely that I will stop doing it. And so having this thing of I just got to get stuff out. I did give myself a month, so it's not like I'm forcing myself to like work faster than I can. It's just what priority it is. And if I don't get it out within a certain amount of time and it's not much of a priority, I'm just going to stop. Versus, publishing something that might not be perfect, but is good enough for people to like understand and be inspired by. So hopefully I will see you guys next time, and hopefully there is a next time.